it's Ash from Super Videos, back for another video for Season 8 of The Walking Dead. In this video, we're going to be discussing whether Simon was the leader before Negan. So this discussion basically stems from that very interesting, exciting, and epic and shocking scene from the last episode 805, when we basically had Simon suggest that they can just go and kill all of the members at the hilltop, at the kingdom, and the others in order to regain control over the other communities. And we had Negan slam Lucille on the table and yell at Simon and say that people are a resource and that we should not be killing them. Now, the yelling part itself and him saying that people are a resource and everything is one aspect of it, but the other aspect, and the more interesting aspect, is what he said right after. He tells Simon, maybe you're confused about who we are. Maybe you're confused about who's in charge here. Are we backsliding, Simon? Please don't tell me we're backsliding. Now that's very interesting because it basically hints that there was some sort of history between Simon and Negan. Something happened between them. There was some sort of power struggle between them in the past. Maybe at some point Simon and Negan had this confrontation or conflict regarding who was really in charge. So when Negan says, are we backsliding? He's basically asking Simon if they're going back to the way things were, if they're going to go back to something that has happened in the past. Now, I did do another video on this before, but this is going to be a follow-up of that video. So what I actually did is read a few comments and, found some very interesting theories out there that I can actually talk about here and get more of your opinions on. So there's actually 4 scenarios in which this could go. The first scenario is the scenario that I actually discussed in my other video, which is actually the first thing that I thought about when this scene happened. This first scenario being before Negan was the leader, somebody else was the leader. So maybe the leader before Negan led the saviors or whoever the community was called back then in a way that Simon and Negan didn't agree with or didn't believe in. And maybe Negan and Simon made up this pact to work together and overthrow the other leader. And maybe once that happened, there was this sort of power struggle between Simon and Negan in terms of who should be leading this community of people. And maybe there was some sort of disagreement, some sort of conflict, maybe some sort of tension between them in terms of who should be leading, who should be in charge. And this goes back to what Negan says in the episode. Are you confused about who's in charge here? And if you kind of go back into the other parts of the episode and listen to what Negan tells Father Gabriel, he does talk about the prior leader of the sanctuary. So this is the first scenario, and it's the one that I immediately thought about when this happened. But now thinking back, I think there are other more interesting and more likely scenarios out there. So the second scenario is that Simon was the previous leader and Negan overthrew him and became the new leader of the Saviors and made Simon his right-hand man. But Simon is not directly in charge of anything. He's just the right-hand man. He is the top-level lieutenant after Negan. Obviously Negan being the leader. And when Negan says, are we backsliding here? Maybe you're confused about who's in charge. Maybe that's referring to that. Maybe Negan is saying, are we going back to you wanting to be in charge again? And, are we going to have the same sort of tension? Because obviously there must have been a tension between them if that happened for Negan to overthrow Simon. So maybe that's what this is referring to. So the third theory is that Negan was the leader and this tension or this history between Negan and Simon happened after Negan was already the leader. So maybe Negan was the leader and maybe there was a point in time when Simon didn't agree with Negan's leadership and called him out on something, and maybe he wanted to overthrow Negan. Maybe he led a rebellion against Negan or something along those lines. Maybe it wasn't as extreme as that, but maybe there was this tension. Now, if this is the case, there's 2 ways it could go. The first is that Simon was doing this for the better and to make the lives of the people at the sanctuary and the saviors better. So maybe he didn't agree with how brutal Negan was. And that's what led to him wanting to change things, wanting to overthrow Negan. That's one scenario. The second scenario is that Simon wanted to be even more brutal. Maybe he thought that Negan was soft. Maybe at that time Negan was soft. Maybe he wasn't as brutal as he is now. And maybe that's what led to that tension between them back then and caused Simon to challenge Negan's leadership. So that particular scenario can be broken down into two sub-levels. Now for this particular scenario, I think this is also very likely to be the case. It's entirely possible for Simon to have challenged Negan at some point. But if we're kind of comparing these scenarios, I would say this is the most unlikely one, because if that happened, if Simon challenged Negan at some point, I don't see any way that Simon would either continue to be Negan's right-hand man, or if he wasn't at that time, would become Negan's right-hand man. So because of that, I feel like this scenario is the most unlikely from all of the four that I'm talking about in this video. The last scenario, which is the most interesting and the most relevant one, and the one that basically raises a lot of questions, is that maybe this has a lot to do with the Oceanside. So if you remember, the Oceanside told Tara that the Saviors came in and executed all of the men and boys above 10 or something like that. So only leaving the female alive, which is what caused all of the females at the Oceanside to run away and to find a new place to survive. So maybe when Simon was Negan's right-hand man at that time, he was put in charge to go to the Oceanside and deal with the Oceanside when the men were still alive, when they were back in the original camp they were in. And maybe Simon went against protocol and did something that Negan didn't want to do and murdered all of the men and the boys above 10 by executing them, shooting all of them in the back of the head. And maybe that's what created this conflict between Negan and Simon. And maybe when Negan is saying, "Are we backsliding here?" he is basically referring to that. And if you think about this whole thing about people being a resource, it makes a lot of sense. And this seems to be the most likely scenario. So what I mean by that, in this case, in the last episode, Simon wanted to just kill everybody, but Negan became very angry and yelled at Simon and said, "People are a resource." So that's pretty much related to the Oceanside. The same sort of scenario happened back then. So if this is the case, back then when Simon was put in charge to deal with Oceanside, he just murdered most of the Oceanside and killed all of them. Negan didn't agree with it because he believes that people are a resource and that people are the foundation of what they're building, like he said. So I'm pretty sure that would have ticked Negan off and it would have caused this conflict between Simon and Negan. So if we're kind of thinking about the things that we already know and the things that have happened so far in the TV show, this is the most likely scenario. For the first scenario, which is that Negan and Simon overthrew the last leader, there is really no proof for it. There is no supporting argument. It's just the first thing that I thought of, but there's really nothing backing it up. Same goes with the second theory, which is that Simon was the leader. There's really nothing backing that up other than it being the other logical explanation for this. The third scenario, which is that Simon challenged Negan at some point, like I said, that's unlikely because if that happened, Simon would not still be Negan's right-hand man. Negan would not trust Simon to make him his right-hand man and to give him this much power. Even though it's not as much as Negan himself, it's still a significant amount of power with respect to Gavin and Dwight. But the last scenario, which involves the Oceanside, there's actually a lot of things supporting it. There's a lot of things that have happened that prove that this is actually what happened. And maybe when Oceanside comes back into this war, this would be answered. Maybe Simon is going to be there and maybe there's going to be some sort of dialogue or maybe some sort of scene with the Oceanside and Negan and Simon that explains that shines a lot of light in what happened at the Oceanside when the Saviors went there. Another interesting thing that I just thought of is the parallel scenario with this, if it's true, and what happened in the last episode between Rick and Daryl. So in the show, Rick, who's the leader, doesn't want to kill all of the Saviors. He wants to kill the ones that are soldiers or are loyal to Negan. But on the other side, his right-hand man, Daryl, disagrees with him and wants to kill all of the Saviors. Now on the flip side of it, the same thing happened at the Sanctuary. Negan, who is the leader of the Saviors, didn't want to kill the other survivors, the other communities. He didn't want to kill the men at the Oceanside. But Simon, his right-hand man, did. So there's this kind of parallel scenario that would also kind of back up, that would also support the fact that Simon was the one that executed everybody at the Oceanside. So putting everything together, this last scenario seems the most likely. That's basically all I wanted to share, but before I end this video, I just want to name a few users who actually came up with some of these theories or wrote about some of these theories in the last video. So username Real Talk or Walk was the one that brought up the other scenario where Simon was the previous leader. And then username Melissa was the one that brought up that other scenario with Simon having killed all of the men at Oceanside. Thank you both of you for writing those theories. Those were definitely interesting theories, and they actually made me think of that scene in an entirely different way. So I appreciate you guys actually participating and sharing your thoughts. But I want to know other people's opinions about this as well. Out of these 4 scenarios, which one do you think is the most likely? And do you think there are other scenarios that we didn't consider here? That's it for this video. See you next time for another super video.